She called me a failure and took everything. Then I opened the box. You know that feeling when you walk into a place where you absolutely don't belong? Where every surface screams that you're out of your league. That's exactly how I felt sitting in Brad Morrison's office on the 42nd floor of some glass tower in downtown Chicago. The kind of building where even the elevator judges you. The place was all chrome and glass. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city like we were gods looking down on the little people. Everything was white or silver or that particular shade of gray that rich people call sophisticated. The chairs probably cost more than my truck. Hell, the art on the walls probably cost more than I made in 5 years restoring antique clocks and music boxes. I'm Arthur Webb, 55 years old, worked with my hands my whole life. And right then, sitting in that sterile conference room, my hands felt like they were broadcasting my entire biography to anyone who looked. Rough calluses on the palms. Small scars from slipped screwdrivers and razor-sharp metal edges. There was still a dark smudge of oil under my right thumbnail that I couldn't quite scrub out that morning, no matter how hard I tried. The air conditioning was set to Arctic, made the whole place feel like a meat locker. I could smell it, too. That particular scent of expensive offices. Leather, fresh paint, money, the kind of smell that reminds you that you don't belong. Across the table sat Linda, my wife, well, soon-to-be ex-wife, I guess. 23 years of marriage, and she couldn't even look at me. She just sat there scrolling through her phone, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against the screen. French tips, expensive haircut that probably cost $200. Designer handbag sitting on the table like a trophy. When did she become this person? Or maybe she always was, and I was too busy in my garage to notice. Brad Morrison sat at the head of the table like a king holding court. Mid-30s, maybe. One of those guys who probably played lacrosse in college and still brings it up at parties. Suit that costs more than my monthly mortgage payment. Hair gelled back, so perfectly it looked shellacked. And those teeth, man, those teeth were so white they probably glowed in the dark. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. He had this way of talking that made every word sound like he was doing you a favor just by letting it leave his mouth. You know the type. The kind of guy who calls everyone chief or buddy while simultaneously letting you know you're beneath him. The type who's never built anything real in his entire life, but somehow gets to sit in judgment of people who have. Brad slid a stack of papers across that polished table. Had to be 40 pages, maybe 50. The sound of paper on glass echoed in the silence like a slap. He started laying out the terms like he was reading a grocery list. The house goes to Linda. The car goes to Linda. The savings account goes to Linda. My pension? Oh, that gets split right down the middle. Wasn't that generous of him? His voice had this rehearsed quality, like he'd given the same speech 100 times to 100 different broken men sitting in chairs just like mine. The house. Let me tell you about that house. My grandfather built it with his own hands in 1952. Came back from the war, bought a lot on the south side, and spent 2 years building it himself. Post-war construction. Solid oak frame. Real plaster walls. Not this drywall garbage they slap up nowadays. Every corner was square. Every joint was tight. The kind of craftsmanship you don't see anymore. I grew up in that house. Learned to use a lathe in the basement workshop my grandfather built. Proposed to Linda on the front porch swing. Spent 23 years thinking we were building something together. And now some lawyer who probably couldn't hammer a nail straight was telling me it belonged to someone else. I opened my mouth, tried to say something, point out that my grandfather built that place, that it meant something, that you can't just put a price tag on history. But Linda cut me off before I could get a word out. She finally looked up from her phone. Her eyes were cold, not angry, just empty, like she was looking at a stranger. Or worse, like she was looking at a piece of furniture she was tired of. She told me to stop, said I'd spent my whole life messing around with junk in the garage, while real men were building careers, while real men were making something of themselves. Called the house her compensation for wasted years with a failure. That word hung in the air. Failure. Brad didn't even flinch. Just kept that professional smile plastered on his face like he'd heard worse. Like he'd sat through 1,000 of these meetings where one spouse gutted the other with words sharper than knives. I won't lie to you. That hurt. Hurt worse than the time I dropped a 50-pound flywheel on my foot. Worse than when I found out she'd been seeing someone else for 6 months before she even asked for the divorce. Because part of me wondered if she was right. I'd spent 30 years restoring antique mechanisms that most people threw away. Grandfather clocks, pocket watches, music boxes, ship chronometers. Things nobody cared about anymore. Things people called junk until someone like me showed them what they really were. I never made much money at it. Never wanted to. Really. I just loved the work. The precision. The history. The way you could hold something a craftsman made 200 years ago and still see their genius in every gear tooth and escapement wheel. But sitting in that office, listening to Linda call it junk, call me a failure, man, that cut deep. Brad jumped back in. His voice had this patronizing edge, like he was explaining something to a child who couldn't quite keep up. He laid out the timeline. Linda wanted the house sold within 30 days. She'd already found a buyer. Some developer who was going to tear it down and put up a McMansion. Tear it down. My grandfather's house. The house he built with his hands. The house where he taught me that real value isn't about flash or show. It's about quality. Precision. Things built to last. They were going to bulldoze it for some cookie-cutter monstrosity with granite countertops and a 3-car garage. I felt my jaw tighten. My hands clenched under the table. The leather portfolio in front of Brad probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Everything in this office was expensive. Everything was designed to intimidate. And that's when I noticed it. Brad's watch. He'd gesture with his left hand while he was talking. And the afternoon sun coming through those massive windows caught the metal. Flash gold. A Rolex Daytona. Or at least, that's what it was supposed to be. Now, I've spent my entire adult life working with timepieces. Started when I was 12 and my grandfather showed me how to service a pocket watch. Learned to read the language of gears and springs and escapements the way other kids learn to read books. I can spot a genuine article from across a room, and Brad Morrison was wearing what was supposed to be a Rolex Daytona on his wrist. Big, gold, flashy, the kind of watch that screams I've made it to everyone in the room. The kind of watch that costs $40,000 if it's real. Except I could see the second hand. In a real Rolex, in any real automatic movement, the second hand sweeps. It flows around the dial smooth as honey, 8 beats per second, creating this beautiful continuous motion. It's poetry and mechanics. Precision engineering at its finest. Brad's second hand was ticking. Tick, tick, tick. Little jerky movements, 1 per second, like a $20 quartz watch you buy at a gas station. It was a fake, a $200 knockoff, maybe less. And just like that, sitting in that cold conference room while my wife called me a failure and some shark lawyer divided up my life, I understood exactly who Brad Morrison was. All flash, all surface, a costume made of expensive fabric wrapped around nothing. He was selling an image of success so hard that he couldn't afford the actual props. So he faked them, put a counterfeit Rolex on his wrist, and hoped nobody would look close enough to see the truth. The whole thing was a performance. The suit, the teeth, the office, the confidence. All of it was as fake as that watch. That gave me something. Not hope, exactly, but clarity. This guy wasn't smarter than me. He was just louder. Just shinier, and he'd gotten so used to people being intimidated by the performance that he'd stopped checking if anyone was actually buying it. He saw people like me, people with oil under their fingernails and calluses on their palms, and he assumed we were too dumb to notice the difference between real and fake. Fatal mistake. My grandfather taught me something when I was young. He'd hold up a gear from some old clock, and he'd say, "Arthur, real quality doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just is. The best mechanisms don't shine. They work. And the loudest ones are usually compensating for something." I looked at Brad with his fake Rolex and his rehearsed confidence, and I understood the game better than he did. I did some quick math in my head. A court battle would take years. Lawyers like Brad charge $500 an hour minimum. I had maybe $12,000 in my personal account. I'd be broke in a month, and Linda would still get the house anyway. Judges in this state tend to favor the spouse who didn't spend their marriage in a garage. There's an old saying, might have been Sun Tzu, might have been my granddad. Sometimes you've got to lose the battle to win the war. Give them what they think they want. Let them think they've won. And then make your real move when they're not looking. Brad was still talking, going on about timelines and filings and court dates. Linda was back on her phone, probably texting Derek. Yeah, I knew about Derek. Sales manager. Drives a leased BMW. Talks about his fantasy football league at parties. They both thought this was over. Thought they'd broken me. Thought I was a rollover and accept whatever scraps they threw my way. They saw an old man with dirty hands and an outdated skill set. Someone who couldn't keep up with the modern world. Someone who'd wasted his life on things that didn't matter. They saw exactly what they expected to see. But here's what they didn't see. What they couldn't see because they'd never bothered to actually look. They didn't see 30 years of expertise. 30 years of learning to recognize value in places other people only saw junk. 30 years of patience and precision and understanding how mechanisms really work. They didn't see a man who'd spent his entire life studying the difference between what things appear to be and what they actually are. They saw a failure. They didn't see a craftsman who was about to turn their own greed against them. I took a deep breath, let it out slow, felt my heartbeat steady. Brad pushed the papers closer, tapped his finger on the signature line. That fake Rolex caught the light again. Tick, tick, tick. Linda glanced up from her phone, long enough to give me a look, impatient, like I was wasting her time. And in that moment, I made my decision. I wasn't going to fight them for the house. Wasn't going to drag this through courts for years. Wasn't going to waste my time and money on a battle I'd probably lose anyway. No, I was going to give them exactly what they wanted, and they were going to give me exactly what I needed. The trick with any good mechanism is understanding leverage, where to apply pressure, when to release it, how to use someone's own momentum against them. Brad and Linda wanted the house. Fine, they could have it. They wanted the car, the savings, half my pension. Fine, take it all. But there was one thing they'd overlooked. One thing they thought was worthless. One thing they'd be happy to let me walk away with. My junk. My collection. 30 years of boxes and tools and broken clocks. Sitting in that garage they couldn't wait to bulldoze. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. He used to say, the best chess players don't make the obvious move. They make the move that sets up 3 moves later. I looked at Brad with his counterfeit watch and his genuine arrogance. Looked at Linda with her designer bag and her cold eyes. They thought they'd already won. They had no idea the game had just started. Brad was wrapping up his speech, asking if I had any questions. His tone suggested he didn't actually want me to ask anything. He wanted me to sign and get out so he could bill Linda for another hour and move on to his next client. Linda was already standing up, already mentally out of this room, already planning her new life in her new condo with her new man. They both looked at me with that particular blend of pity and contempt. The look you give someone who's already beaten. Someone who doesn't have the fight, left to make things difficult. And I let them see exactly what they expected. I sat there in my flannel shirt and work boots, hands folded on the table, oil still visible under my thumbnail. I looked tired, defeated, like a man who just realized he'd lost everything and didn't have the energy to fight back. I looked exactly like what they thought I was, a broken old failure who'd wasted his life on junk. They exchanged a glance. Brad and Linda, a look of complete understanding. Victory. Relief that this was going to be easy. Brad's fake Rolex caught the light one more time as he reached for the papers. Tick, 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 counting down to a moment they couldn't see coming. They had won the battle, taken the house, taken everything, and they had absolutely no idea that I'd just started playing a completely different game, a game they didn't even know existed. In that cold conference room, 42 floors above Chicago, Brad Morrison and Linda Webb looked at me and saw victory. They saw a broken old man who'd just lost everything. They didn't see the craftsman who'd spent a lifetime learning to recognize what things were really worth. They didn't see the collector who'd been patient enough to wait 23 years for exactly the right moment. They didn't see the player who just made the opening move in a game that would end very differently than they imagined. They saw a broken old man. They didn't know that at that exact moment, I'd already begun my end game. Here's the thing about setting a trap. The bait has to look worthless to everyone except the person you want to catch. And the person you're catching has to think they're the hunter, not the prey. I sat there in that conference room, watching Brad Morrison's fake Rolex tickets lying rhythm, and I knew exactly what I had to do next. But I also knew it had to be their choice, their decision, their greed that sealed the deal. Because if I was going to win this, it had to be clean, legal, bulletproof. So I gave them a chance. A real one. I cleared my throat. Brad and Linda both looked at me like they'd forgotten I was still in the room. Like I was a piece of furniture they were trying to figure out how to dispose of. I said we needed to talk about the garage. Linda rolled her eyes. Brad checked his phone. Neither of them thought this was going to be important. I told them there were hundreds of boxes in that garage. 30 years of collection. Estate sale finds. Auction purchases. Pieces I'd picked up from widows cleaning out their late husbands' workshops. Brad made this little impatient gesture with his hand. The get-to-the-point motion. That fake Rolex caught the light again. I kept my voice steady. Told him that some of those pieces might have antique value. That under Illinois law, we were supposed to get an independent appraisal of all marital assets before finalizing the division. That it was the right thing to do. The legal thing to do. That we should hire a certified appraiser to go through the garage and document everything properly. The silence that followed was beautiful. Brad stared at me like I just suggested we build a rocket ship. Linda's mouth actually fell open a little. Then Brad started laughing. Not a polite chuckle. A real laugh. The kind that says you just heard the stupidest thing anyone's ever said. He was practically wiping tears from his eyes. He asked if I was serious. An appraiser? For garage junk? He leaned forward, and I could see him doing the math in his head. The kind of math lawyers are really good at. Billable hours, delays, complications. He said a certified appraiser would cost $5,000, minimum. Maybe more if the collection was as extensive as I claimed. That it would take weeks to catalog everything. That it would push the divorce proceedings back by 2 months, maybe 3. And here's where Brad made his first real mistake. He said Linda wanted to close on the house sale next week, that she had a buyer lined up, that any delay would kill the deal, that the buyer would walk and she'd lose out on a really good price. Linda jumped in. She was getting agitated now. Said she wasn't about to waste $5,000 in 2 months of her life, so some appraiser could tell her that my rusty junk was worth nothing. She said I could take my trash and disappear, that she wanted this over, that she wanted to move on with her life. The contempt in her voice was so thick, you could spread it on toast. I sat back in my chair, let the silence hang there for a second. This was the moment, the fulcrum point, the place where the trap would either spring shut or fail completely. I said okay, if that's what they wanted. But I needed it in writing. I needed documentation that they were waiving any claim to the contents of the garage, that they acknowledged they'd been given the opportunity for an appraisal and had declined. Brad's eyes lit up. He thought he'd won, thought he'd just saved his client $5,000 and gotten rid of a complication. He actually smiled at me, patronizing, like he was dealing with a child who'd finally seen reason. He pulled his laptop closer and started typing. His fingers flew over the keyboard. Probably had a template for this sort of thing. Probably added clauses to divorce agreements 12 times a week. I watched him work. Watched that fake Rolex slide up and down his wrist as he typed. Tick, tick, tick. Linda went back to her phone. Already mentally checked out. Already planning her new life in her new condo with her new boyfriend. Neither of them stopped to ask why I was being so cooperative all of a sudden. Why I was practically helping them write me out of everything I owned. That should have been their second clue. But they were too busy congratulating themselves to notice. Brad spun his laptop around so I could see the screen. Asked if this language looked acceptable. I read it carefully. Every word, every comma. The document stated that Party B, Linda Webb, acknowledged that the garage attached to the marital property at the Chicago address contained various tools, equipment parts, and collectibles belonging to Party A, Arthur Webb. That Party B had been offered the option of hiring an independent certified appraiser to evaluate said contents. That Party B declined this option in the interest of expediting the divorce proceedings. That Party B acknowledged the contents of the garage to be of negligible commercial value, estimated at $0.00. My heart was hammering in my chest. I could feel sweat forming on my palms. But I kept my face blank, tired, defeated. The words on that screen were the most beautiful thing I'd seen in 23 years of marriage. $0.00. Negligible commercial value. Waives any and all future claims to said property. Brad asked if I had any changes. Any objections? I told him it looked fine. Perfect, actually. He nodded, started to print it out. The printer in the corner whirred to life. 3 copies. 1 for me, 1 for Linda, 1 for the court. While we waited, I thought about a quote from Oscar Wilde, something I'd read years ago in a book my grandfather had on his shelf. A cynic is a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. Brad and Linda were cynics. They saw dollar signs, price tags, market value. They looked at 30 years of careful collection and saw junk. They looked at antique mechanisms and saw rust. They looked at history and saw trash. And that blindness, that absolute certainty that they knew what things were worth, was about to cost them everything. The printer spit out the last page. Brad gathered up the papers, tapped them against the desk to align them perfectly, and slid them across the table with a pen. He pointed to the signature lines, told me to sign all 3 copies. I picked up the pen. It was heavy in my hand. One of those expensive Mont Blanc pens that cost more than most people spend on groceries in a month. The weight of it felt significant, like I was signing something more than just a legal document, like I was signing a contract with fate itself. I started to read through it one more time. Slowly, Brad made an impatient sound, told me we'd already reviewed it, that it was exactly what I'd asked for. Linda sighed loudly, said she had somewhere to be. I ignored them both. Read every single word. Made sure the language was airtight. Made sure there were no loopholes, no escape clauses, no way for them to come back later and claim they'd been misled. It was all there, black and white, legal and binding. Party B waives any and all rights, claims, or interest in the contents of the garage. Party B acknowledges said contents to have 0 commercial value. Party B declines the option of independent appraisal. Perfect. I signed the first copy. The pen scratched across the paper. In that quiet office, it sounded like thunder. Signed the second copy. Signed the third. The ink was dark blue. Permanent. Binding. Brad snatched up the papers before I could even put the pen down. He was already moving on mentally. Already thinking about his next client. Already calculating his billable hours for this meeting. Linda stood up, gathered her designer bag, checked her reflection in the window. She looked satisfied, relieved, like she'd just gotten away with something. Neither of them said goodbye. Linda just walked out. Brad mumbled something about filing deadlines and court dates, but I wasn't really listening. I sat there for a moment after they left, alone in that conference room with its chrome and glass and expensive art. I looked down at my copy of the agreement, at Linda's signature next to mine, at Brad's notary stamp making it all official. I folded it carefully, slipped it into my jacket pocket. Then I stood up and walked out. The elevator ride down was long, 42 floors. I watched the numbers descend and thought about what had just happened. I'd given them a chance, a real, legitimate chance to do this right, to get an appraisal, to follow the law. They'd laughed at me, called my life's work junk. Couldn't wait to sign away any claim to it. And now it was done. Legal, binding, irreversible. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. I walked past the security desk, past the indoor waterfall, past all that expensive marble and steel, pushed through the revolving door, and stepped outside. It had started raining while I was upstairs. Not a light drizzle. A real Chicago rain. The kind that comes down hard and cold and soaks you to the bone in seconds. I didn't have an umbrella. Didn't matter. I walked the 3 blocks to where I'd parked my truck. By the time I got there, I was drenched. Water running down my neck. My flannel shirt stuck to my back. My work boots squelching with every step. I unlocked the truck and climbed in. Sat there for a minute, with water dripping off me onto the worn seats. Through the rain-streaked windshield, I could see that glass tower where Brad Morrison was probably already on a call with his next client, where Linda was probably in the bathroom touching up her makeup before heading off to meet Derek for lunch. They thought they'd won. Thought they'd gotten everything. The house, the car, the money, and they'd managed to get rid of me and my junk without spending $5,000 on an appraiser. Smart, efficient, a clean victory. Except they'd never bothered to ask why I'd made it so easy for them. Never wondered why I'd practically written that waiver myself. Never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, someone who'd spent 30 years studying antique mechanisms might know something they didn't. I started the truck. The engine rumbled to life. Turned on the wipers. They slapped back and forth across the windshield, clearing the rain for a second before it came back. Pulled out into traffic. Chicago in the rain. Gray sky. Gray buildings, gray pavement. Everything the color of old metal. I drove toward my apartment. The small 1-bedroom place I'd been renting for the past 3 months. But I had one stop to make first. The garage. My grandfather's garage. The one Linda had just signed away any claim to. I had to pick something up. The rain was coming down harder now. Real Midwestern weather. The kind that makes you remember you're living in a place that doesn't care about your comfort. I pulled into the driveway of the house. My house. Except it wasn't mine anymore. Linda owned it now. Would own it for about another week before she sold it to the developer who was going to tear it down. The garage stood separate from the house. Detached. My grandfather had built it that way on purpose. Wanted his workspace separate from his living space. Wanted a place where he could make noise and work late without disturbing anyone. I had a key. Would have access for another 2 weeks to clear everything out. I unlocked the side door and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately. Oil, metal, wood, dust. The smell of 30 years of work. The smell of every Sunday afternoon I'd spent out here while Linda watched TV in the house. Every late night after dinner, when I'd come out here to restore some piece that everyone else thought was beyond saving. Boxes everywhere. Stacked on shelves, lined up against walls, organized in a system that made perfect sense to me and would look like chaos to anyone else. Tools hanging on pegboards. My grandfather's original workbench, still solid after 70 years. The good light he'd installed, daylight bulbs that let you see the true color of old brass and copper. This was my kingdom, my sanctuary. And Linda had just given it all to me for $0. I walked to the back of the garage, to the high shelf where I kept the pieces that needed climate control, the sensitive ones, the valuable ones. There was one box in particular, medium-sized, wooden, plain, the kind of box you glance at and keep walking. I pulled it down, felt the familiar weight of it in my hands. This box had been sitting on this shelf for 20 years. 20 years of marriage to Linda. 20 years of her walking past this garage and never once asking what was inside, never once caring enough to look. 20 years of waiting for exactly the right moment. I carried the box to my truck, set it carefully on the passenger seat, made sure it was secure, went back and locked the garage. Stood there in the rain for a second, looking at the building my grandfather had constructed with such care, looking at the house beyond it, the house where 3 generations of my family had lived. In a week, it would all be rubble. But what was in that box on my passenger seat would outlast all of it. I got back in the truck, pulled out of the driveway one last time. The rain was relentless now. Visibility was terrible. Wipers on full speed. Headlights barely cutting through the gray. But I wasn't thinking about the rain, or the traffic, or the house I'd just left behind. I was thinking about the look on Brad's face when he'd laughed at my suggestion of an appraiser. The look on Linda's face when she called my collection worthless junk. The confidence in their voices when they'd signed that document declaring everything in my garage to be worth exactly $0.00. They knew the price of everything. Brad with his $500 an hour billing rate and his $200 fake Rolex. Linda with her designer handbag and her carefully calculated settlement that gave her the house and the car and the bank account. They'd done the math, added up the dollars, divided the assets, made sure they got the maximum value, and they'd thrown away something they couldn't even begin to understand because they'd never learned the difference between price and value. I pulled up to my apartment, parked in my assigned spot. The rain was still coming down. I didn't care anymore. Grabbed the box from the passenger seat, held it against my chest like it was the most precious thing in the world, which, as it turned out, it was, ran through the rain to the building entrance, up the stairs to my second-floor apartment, unlocked the door and stepped inside, set the box on my kitchen table, stood there for a minute, dripping water onto the linoleum floor. My phone buzzed. Text message from Brad's office. Some automated thing about file documents and court dates. I deleted it without reading. I didn't need reminders about court dates. I needed to open this box. But not yet. Not quite yet. First, I needed to dry off. Change clothes. Make myself a cup of coffee. Let the moment settle. Because what was in this box had been waiting for 20 years. It could wait another hour. And I wanted to savor this. Every second of it. I thought about Brad and Linda. Wondered what they were doing right now. Probably celebrating. Probably patting themselves on the back for how well they'd handled things. How efficiently they'd gotten rid of the dead weight. Linda was probably already shopping for furniture for her new place. Already planning her fresh start. Brad was probably already billing her for the afternoon's work. 3 hours at $500 an hour. $1,500 for helping her divorce a failure. They'd won. Clean victory. Everything they wanted. Or so they thought. See, there's something they teach you when you're learning to restore antique mechanisms. Something my grandfather drilled into me from day one. The most valuable pieces never announce themselves. They don't shine. They don't flash. They don't demand attention. They sit quietly in plain wooden boxes on dusty shelves in forgotten garages. And they wait for someone who knows what they're looking at. Someone with patience, with expertise, with the ability to see past surface rust to precision underneath. Someone who understands that true value has nothing to do with price tags. I changed into dry clothes, put on a pot of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table. The box sat in front of me, plain wood, tarnished brass hinges, no markings, nothing to indicate what was inside. Anyone else would have walked right past it. Linda had walked past it for 20 years. But I knew, had known since the moment I bought it at an estate sale in 1995 for $50. The widow selling her late husband's effects had no idea what she had. Thought it was just an old broken clock her husband had picked up somewhere. I'd known better. Had known what it was the second I'd seen the mechanism inside. Outside my window, the rain continued to fall. Chicago in April. Unpredictable. Harsh. Real. In that glass tower downtown, Brad Morrison was probably packing up for the day. Probably feeling pretty good about himself. Another successful client meeting. Another billable day. Linda was probably already at some restaurant with Derek. Probably telling him about how well the divorce had gone. How she'd gotten everything. How Arthur had just rolled over and let her take it all. They were both so pleased with themselves. So certain they'd won. I poured myself a cup of coffee. Black. No sugar. The way my grandfather used to drink it. Sat back down at the table. Put my hands on either side of the box. In a few minutes, I was going to open it. Going to see something I hadn't looked at in years. Something I had been protecting. Preserving. Waiting for the right moment to reveal. That moment had finally come. But first, I wanted to think about how we'd gotten here. About the choices people make. About greed and blindness and the absolute certainty that comes from knowing the price of everything. Brad had laughed when I suggested an appraisal. Actually laughed. Like it was the funniest joke he'd heard all week. Linda had called it junk. Rusty trash. Something she wouldn't waste $5,000 evaluating. They'd been so sure, so absolutely confident in their assessment, and they'd put it in writing, signed their names to a legal document declaring that everything in my garage, everything I'd spent 30 years collecting, was worth exactly $0. Negligible commercial value. Waived all rights. Declined independent appraisal. I took a sip of coffee. It was hot, strong, grounded me. The rain outside was starting to let up, just a little. The worst of the storm was passing. I reached for the box. My hands were steady. No shaking, no hesitation. Just the calm certainty of a man who'd been patient enough to wait for the right moment, who'd been smart enough to let his enemies defeat themselves, who'd understood that sometimes the best move is no move at all, just patience, just waiting for the other player to make a mistake. And Brad and Linda had made a huge one. I drove through Chicago in the rain. No house, no wife, no family, just me and my truck, and a wooden box on the passenger seat. But for the first time in 20 years, I felt something I'd almost forgotten the taste of. Hope, real hope, the kind that comes from knowing something nobody else knows, from holding value that everyone else mistook for junk. The rain came down harder. The wipers slapped back and forth. The world outside was gray and cold and indifferent, but inside my truck I was warm, because I knew something Brad and Linda didn't. I knew what was in that box. I pulled into my apartment parking lot, killed the engine, sat there for a moment with the rain drumming on the roof, with that box sitting next to me. 20 years I'd waited. 20 years of being patient, of being overlooked, of being called a failure. 20 years of knowing that someday the right moment would come. And today, in a conference room 42 floors above the city, watching Brad Morrison's fake Rolex, tickets lying rhythm, I'd known that moment had arrived. They'd given me exactly what I needed, put it in writing, made it legal, and now there was nothing they could do about it. I picked up the box, held it carefully, got out of the truck, and ran through the rain to my building, up the stairs, into my apartment, set the box on the table, and stood there, dripping wet, looking at it. This was it, the moment everything changed. I'd driven through the rain without a house and without a family, but for the first time in 20 years, I felt like the richest man in the world. It was time to open the box. The box sat on my kitchen table, like it had been waiting its whole life for this exact moment. I'd changed into dry clothes, made coffee, taken my time, because rushing this would be like rushing the final movement of a symphony. Some things demand respect, ceremony, the proper amount of reverence. My hands were steady as I reached for it. No shaking, no hesitation, just the calm certainty of a man who'd been patient for 20 years and was finally about to collect his reward. The wooden box was plain, red mahogany, but aged and darkened with time. Brass hinges that had developed a green patina. No markings, no labels, nothing to indicate what was inside. I ran my fingers over the surface, felt the grain of the wood, the slight imperfections that told you this was handmade by someone who knew what they were doing. The lid was held shut by a simple brass clasp. I flipped it open. The mechanism made a soft click. That sound took me right back to 1995, to a garage sale in Evanston, to a widow in her 70s who was selling her late husband's effects because her kids didn't want any of it. She'd had tables full of tools, boxes of parts, a lifetime of collection that her family saw as junk taking up space in the garage. I'd been there early, 7 a.m, first one through the door, and I'd seen this box sitting on a shelf behind some paint cans. I lifted the lid slowly. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, that particular scent of aged brass and steel. And underneath it all, something else. The faint smell of oil, the good stuff, watchmaker's oil, the kind that costs $200 an ounce and lasts for centuries if it's applied correctly. Inside the box, wrapped in what had once been white cloth but was now yellow with age, was a chronometer. I unwrapped it carefully. The cloth fell away like old skin, and there it was, Even after 20 years of knowing what I had, seeing it again took my breath away. The case was brass, about the size of a softball, tarnished to a deep brown gold color that only comes with age. But you could still see the craftsmanship. Every edge was perfect. Every surface was true. The face was porcelain, white as bone, Roman numerals in black. And in the center, in script so fine you needed a magnifying glass to read it properly, were the words that made this worth more than gold. Harrison, London, 1773. Let me tell you something about maritime chronometers. Back in the 1700s, they were more valuable than gold, more valuable than diamonds, because they solve a problem that had been killing sailors for centuries. Latitude was easy. You could figure out how far north or south you were by looking at the stars. But longitude, east and west, that required something else. Required knowing the exact time. See, the Earth rotates. If you know what time it is in London, and you know what time it is where you are based on the sun, you can calculate how far east or west you've traveled. Simple geometry. Except there was no way to keep accurate time on a ship. Pendulum clocks didn't work because of the motion. Temperature changes threw everything off. Salt air corroded mechanisms. Ships were getting lost, running aground. Sailors were dying. So the British government offered a prize, £20,000, a fortune, to anyone who could build a clock that would keep accurate time at sea. John Harrison spent his entire life solving that problem. Built 5 chronometers, each one better than the last, each one more precise, more reliable, more revolutionary. H1 through H5, 5 mechanisms that changed the world, that made global navigation possible, that turned the ocean from a mystery into a highway. Those chronometers were the GPS of their time, the cutting edge of technology, the difference between life and death. And one of them was sitting on my kitchen table. The widow who sold it to me had no idea. Her husband had been an engineer, worked for a defense contractor, collected mechanical things. She said he'd bought it at an estate sale in the 60s, paid $25 for it, thought it was interesting. She wanted $50. I gave her $60. Didn't haggle, didn't try to talk her down, just paid her what she asked, packed it carefully and took it home. Spent that whole night researching, comparing, measuring, checking every detail against the historical records. And slowly, piece by piece, I became certain. This wasn't a reproduction, wasn't a later copy. This was the real thing. H5, the 5th and final chronometer, the masterpiece, the one that had disappeared in the 1780s, the one historians thought had been destroyed in a warehouse fire in London. I kept it quiet for 20 years. Never told anyone, never showed anyone. Just wrapped it carefully and put it on a high shelf in my garage where the temperature stayed constant and the humidity was controlled. Checked on it once a year. Made sure the oil hadn't degraded. Made sure the mechanism was still perfect. And waited for Linda to push me too far. Waited for the right moment. Waited for the universe to align in exactly the right way. And 2 days ago, in Brad Morrison's office, watching his fake Rolex tick its lying rhythm, I'd known that moment had arrived. I sat there at my kitchen table, holding a piece of history in my hands, holding something that had been lost for 2.5 centuries, holding what might be the most significant horological discovery of the modern era. And Linda had just signed away any claim to it, put it in writing, made it legal, declared it to be worth exactly $0.00. The irony was almost painful, but I wasn't ready to celebrate yet. Because knowing what you have and proving what you have are 2 very different things. I needed an expert, needed authentication, needed someone with credentials and reputation to confirm what I already knew. And I knew exactly who to call. Sotheby's in New York has a horology department, the best in the world. They handle estate sales of important collections, authenticate museum acquisitions, set world records at auction for significant timepieces. I'd done my research over the years, knew the names, knew the experts. There was one guy in particular, Dr. Richard Pemberton, British, 70-something, had written a definitive book on Harrison's chronometers. Had examined H1 through H4 dozens of times at the British Museum. If anyone could authenticate H5, it was him. I packed the chronometer carefully, triple boxed it with foam padding, insured it for $1 million, which was probably 10% of what it was actually worth, but the insurance company wouldn't believe anything higher without documentation. Took a train to New York the next morning. Couldn't trust this to shipping. Had to hand carry it. The Sotheby's building on York Avenue looks like a fortress. Glass and steel and security that would make a bank jealous. I walked in carrying my box like it contained nuclear codes. Because, in a way, it kind of did. This was the key to my entire future. The receptionist was polite, but skeptical. Said Dr. Pemberton didn't see walk-ins. Said I needed an appointment. Said I could leave my item for evaluation, and they'd get back to me in 6 to 8 weeks. I told her this was regarding a Harrison chronometer, a potentially significant discovery. That got her attention. She made a call, spoke in hushed tones, hung up, and told me to wait. Dr. Pemberton came down himself 20 minutes later. Tall, thin, white hair and white beard. Looked like he should be teaching at Oxford. Wire-rimmed glasses, tweed jacket with elbow patches, the whole 9 yards. He introduced himself with a British accent, so posh he could cut glass. Said he understood I had something interesting to show him. I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He probably got a dozen people a month claiming to have found a Rembrandt in their attic or a Stradivarius at a garage sale. 99% of them were wrong. Delusional. Scammers. He was being polite. But he didn't believe me. That was fine. I didn't need him to believe me. I needed him to look. He led me to an examination room. All white walls and bright lights. Magnifying equipment. Microscopes. Reference books lining the shelves. I set my box on the examination table. Opened it. Unwrapped the chronometer. Dr. Pemberton's expression didn't change. He pulled on a pair of white cotton gloves, the kind archivists use. Picked up the chronometer like it was made of soap bubbles. He examined the exterior first. Turned it over slowly. Checked the case. The seals. The engraving. I could see his eyebrows rising slightly. The first crack in his professional skepticism. He asked where I'd acquired it. I told him the truth. Estate sale. 1995. Evanston, Illinois. $60. He made a non-committal sound. Set the chronometer down and picked up a jeweler's loop. Examined the dial more closely. Asked if I'd open the case. I told him no. Never. Hadn't wanted to risk damaging anything. He nodded. Said that was wise. Asked if he could open it. I told him that's why I was here. He selected a tool from a drawer. A special screwdriver with a blade. So fine it looked like a needle. Started working on the screws that held the case together. The case was sealed. Those screws probably hadn't been turned in 200 years. But Dr. Pemberton had steady hands and infinite patience. Took him 15 minutes to get the first screw out. The second one came easier. Then the third. The fourth. He lifted the back plate away, and I watched his entire demeanor change. His hand started shaking. Just slightly. Just enough to notice. He set down the case back very carefully, like it was the most precious thing he'd ever held. Picked up a different magnifying tool. This one had a light attached. Started examining the mechanism inside. The silence in that room was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat. Could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Dr. Pemberton's hands were trembling more now. He set down the magnifying glass. Took off his glasses. Wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He pulled from his jacket pocket. He looked at me. Really looked at me. And I could see it in his eyes. Wonder. Disbelief. The expression of a man who'd just seen something he'd spent his entire career studying, but never thought he'd encounter in person. He asked me if I understood what I'd brought him. I told him I had a pretty good idea. He shook his head slowly. Said that unless this was the most sophisticated forgery he'd ever seen, and he didn't believe it was. I was holding Harrison's H5 chronometer, the lost masterpiece, the holy grail of horology. Said he'd need to do more testing, more analysis. But based on what he was seeing, this was the real thing. said the historical community had believed H5 was destroyed in a fire at a London warehouse in 1784, that there were records of the fire, but no records of what happened to the contents. Said this was the single most significant horological discovery in modern history. I sat down. My legs felt weak. Dr. Pemberton was already making phone calls, bringing in other experts, setting up testing equipment. His skepticism had completely evaporated. Now he was moving with purpose, with excitement barely contained by professional decorum. Over the next 3 days, they tested everything. X-rays, metallurgical analysis, carbon dating on the wooden components, comparison with the other Harrison chronometers at the British Museum using detailed photographs. Every test came back the same way. Authentic, original, real. Dr. Pemberton called a meeting on the 4th day, brought in the senior partners from Sotheby's, brought in their legal team, brought in their insurance people. They made me an offer. They wanted to auction it, said this would be the horological event of the century, said collectors and museums from around the world would compete for it, said they estimated it would sell for between $3 and $5 million, maybe more if the bidding got competitive. I authorized the sale, signed the papers, set the auction date for 3 weeks out, gave them time to market it properly, to build the hype, to let the world know that H5 had been found. The news hit the horology community like a bomb. Articles in trade journals, pieces in newspapers, segments on the BBC. The Smithsonian released a statement saying they'd be bidding. The British Museum said the same. Private collectors started circling. Billionaires who collected important historical artifacts. Sotheby's set up a preview. Let qualified bidders examine the chronometer in person. Dr. Pemberton gave lectures on its historical significance, on why this mattered, and the estimated price kept climbing. 5 million, 6 million, 7. The buzz was incredible. I stayed in New York. Couldn't go back to Chicago. Couldn't risk running into Linda or Brad before this was done. Stayed in a cheap hotel in Queens. Watched the news coverage. Watched the horology world lose its collective mind. And waited for auction day. It came on a Tuesday, May 15th. I'll remember that date for the rest of my life. The auction room at Sotheby's was packed. Bidders in person. Bidders on the phone. Online bidding from collectors around the world. I sat in the back. Wore my best flannel shirt. Same work boots I'd worn to Brad's office. Wasn't trying to fit in with the billionaires and museum directors. Wasn't trying to be anything other than what I was. The auctioneer was British. Professional. Started the bidding at $1 million. 3 hands went up immediately. 1.2, 1.5, 1.8. The bids came fast. Increments of 100,000, 200,000, $500,000, 2 million, 2.5, 3. Phones were ringing. Online bids were coming in. The energy in that room was electric. 3.5, 4, 4.2. It came down to 2 bidders. A private collector whose name I didn't recognize, and the British Museum. They went back and forth. $100,000 increments, each one driving the price higher. 4.3, 4.4, 4.5. The tension was incredible. You could have heard a pin drop between bids. 4.6, 4.7. The private collector dropped out at 4.8. The auctioneer looked around the room, asked if there were any other bids. Silence. He raised his gavel. Going once. Going twice. Sold. To the British Museum. For $4.2 million. The room erupted in applause. The museum representative looked relieved. Dr. Pemberton was wiping tears from his eyes. I just sat there, numb. $4.2 million. For something I bought for $60 at a garage sale in Evanston 20 years ago. For something Linda had just declared to be worth $0. For something she'd waived any claim to in writing. The irony was so perfect it almost hurt. The money hit my account the following Tuesday. Wire transfer, $4.2 million, minus Sotheby's commission of 12%, minus Dr. Pemberton's authentication fee, minus a few other expenses. Net to me, $3.6 million. I stared at my bank balance on my phone, refreshed it 3 times to make sure it was real. It was real. I was sitting in my cheap hotel room in Queens. Same flannel shirt, same work boots, same rough hands with oil under the fingernails. But my bank account had more money in it than I had made in my entire working life. I sat there for a long time, just processing. This wasn't about the money. I mean, the money was nice. The money changed everything. But that's not what made this sweet. What made this sweet was knowing that Linda and Brad had done this to themselves, had walked away from this because they were too greedy to spend $5,000 on an appraiser, too arrogant to believe that I might know something they didn't. They'd seen junk. I'd seen value. They'd seen price tags. I'd seen history, and they'd put it in writing. At exactly 2 o'clock that Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. Almost didn't answer it, but something told me to pick up. It was Linda. I could hear it in her voice before she even said a word. The panic, the rage, the absolute disbelief. She'd seen the news. The auction results had been published. The sale was public record. $4.2 million for Harrison's H5 chronometer, formerly owned by Arthur Webb of Chicago. She was screaming, actually screaming, saying I defrauded her, that we'd been married when I bought that chronometer, that it was community property, that half of it was legally hers, said Brad was already preparing a lawsuit, that they were going to take me for everything I had, that I wasn't going to get away with this. I let her finish, let her get it all out, listened to every word. Then I spoke, calm, quiet, the way my grandfather used to talk when he was explaining something to me. I told her to get the divorce agreement, the one Brad had drafted so efficiently, the one she'd been so eager to sign. Told her to turn to page 12, section 4, subsection B. The silence on the other end of the line was beautiful. I kept going. Told her to read the part where she'd acknowledged the contents of the garage to have zero commercial value, where she'd waived any right to appraisal, where she declined the option to hire an independent evaluator. Told her to read the part where she'd sign away any future claims to anything I removed from that garage. Reminded her that I'd offered to get an appraiser, that I'd suggested we do this properly, that I'd given her every chance to follow the law. And she'd laughed at me, called it junk, signed it away for nothing. Her own greed had blinded her. Her own contempt had destroyed her. She hung up on me, just ended the call. Couldn't handle hearing the truth, but I knew that wasn't the end of it. Knew Brad would file something, would try to find a loophole, would argue that I concealed assets or committed fraud or something. So I wasn't surprised when I got served 2 weeks later. Linda Webb versus Arthur Webb. Motion to reopen property settlement. Claim of fraudulent concealment. Brad was arguing that I'd deliberately hidden the chronometer's value, that I'd failed to disclose a marital asset, that the agreement should be voided. Fine, let him argue. I hired my own lawyer, not some flashy downtown shark. Just a solid guy who specialized in contract law, who understood that the best defense is a good document. The hearing was set for July. Cook County Courthouse. Same building where we'd filed the divorce. I showed up in my work boots and flannel. Brad showed up in another expensive suit. Different fake Rolex this time. Still ticking instead of sweeping. Linda sat next to him, looking like she wanted to set me on fire with her mind. The judge was a woman in her 60s. Gray hair. No-nonsense expression. Had probably seen every trick in the book during her 30 years on the bench. Brad stood up to make his argument. Said his client had been deceived. That I'd hidden a valuable asset. That the chronometer should be considered community property, and the proceeds should be split. The judge let him talk. Didn't interrupt. Just listened. Then she asked to see the divorce agreement. Brad handed her a copy. She read it, slowly, page by page. Asked Brad if he drafted this document himself. He said yes, he had. Asked if his client had been advised of her right to an independent appraisal of the garage contents. Brad hesitated. Said yes, but it hadn't seemed necessary for what appeared to be junk. The judge looked at him over her reading glasses. Asked him to confirm that his client had been offered professional appraisal and had declined. Brad said that was correct, but the context was important, and the judge cut him off. She said she'd heard enough, said that Mr. Morrison had drafted an agreement that explicitly gave his client the option of professional appraisal, that his client had declined that option in writing, that his client had acknowledged the garage contents to have zero commercial value, said that Mr. Morrison's client had waived any future claims to said property, that she'd done so knowingly, voluntarily, and with the advice of counsel, said the Latin phrase, ignorantia juris non excusat. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. But in this case, it wasn't even ignorance. It was arrogance, greed, the assumption that someone who worked with their hands couldn't possibly know something a corporate lawyer didn't. Said the motion was denied. The divorce agreement would stand as written. Then she did something I didn't expect. She awarded me attorney's fees. Said that this motion had been frivolous, filed without merit, that Ms. Webb and her counsel should have known better. Said Ms. Webb would be responsible for paying my legal costs. All of them. My lawyer had charged me $40,000. Not cheap, but worth every penny. The judge banged her gavel. Case dismissed. Linda looked like she'd been slapped. Brad looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. And I just sat there, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Vindication. Pure, perfect vindication. The aftermath was almost as satisfying as the hearing itself. Brad sent Linda a bill for his time. The original divorce, the failed motion, the court hearing, came to about $75,000. She had to liquidate assets to pay it, had to sell the car she'd fought so hard for, had to dip into the savings account, and then she had to pay my attorney's fees on top of that. Another $40,000. Between Brad's bill and my lawyer, she was out $115,000. Money she could have avoided spending if she'd just agreed to a $5,000 appraisal. The math was almost poetic. But it got better. Because of all the legal fees and the delayed house sale, Linda missed her closing date with the developer. The buyer walked away, found another property, and by the time Linda got the house back on the market, the window had closed. The developer had moved on. Interest rates had gone up. The market had cooled. The house that she could have sold for $180,000 ended up selling for $140,000. After realtor fees and closing costs, she netted about $125,000, minus the $115,000 she'd spent on legal fees. She walked away from her big victory with about $10,000 and a used Toyota. The house my grandfather built got torn down anyway. New owners put up exactly the kind of McMansion Linda had been dreaming about, but she wasn't living in it. As for me, I took my $3.6 million and made some changes. First thing I did was pay off every debt I had. Wasn't much. Car was paid off. Didn't have credit card debt, just some small stuff. Then I bought property. Not in Chicago. Couldn't stay there. Too many memories. Too much history. I went west. Montana. Found a small ranch about 40 miles outside Billings. 50 acres. Mountain views. A creek running through the property. Had a barn that I converted into a workshop. Proper climate control. Good lighting. All the tools I'd always wanted but could never afford. I don't restore clocks for money anymore. Don't need to. Do it for myself. For the love of it. People hear about me somehow. Word gets around. They bring me pieces they've inherited. Grandfather clocks that haven't run in 50 years. Pocket watches that belong to their great-grandfathers. I fix them. Don't charge anything. Just ask that they take care of the piece once it's running again. That they appreciate what they have. Most people do. Some don't. That's their choice. I've got my workshop. Got my tools. Got my peace and quiet. Got a porch that overlooks the mountains where I sit in the evening and watch the sun go down. I was out there last week, sitting in my chair with a cup of coffee, watching the sky turn pink and orange and purple. Had my grandfather's old pocket watch in my hand, the one he'd carried during the war. Simple, reliable, nothing fancy. Still keeps perfect time. I was thinking about everything that had happened. The divorce, the chronometer, the auction, the courtroom, Thinking about Brad with his fake Rolex and his expensive suits and his absolute certainty that he was smarter than everyone else. Thinking about Linda with her designer bags and her contempt for anything that didn't have an obvious price tag. They'd both known the price of everything, could calculate value down to the penny, but they'd never understood what anything was actually worth. My grandfather used to tell me something when I was a kid. He'd be working on some old clock covered in grease and metal shavings, and he'd say, "Arthur, the best things in life don't announce themselves. They just are. You've got to be patient enough to recognize them." Patience. That was the key. That was always the key. Brad and Linda wanted everything now. Wanted the quick win, the easy victory. Didn't want to wait. Didn't want to look deeper. And it cost them everything. I thought about that chronometer sometimes. About H5. About John Harrison spending his entire life building 5 mechanisms that changed the world. About how the 5th one had disappeared for 240 years. Had sat in warehouses and workshops and garages. Had been bought and sold and forgotten and rediscovered. Had ended up in my hands. Not because I was special. Not because I was lucky. Because I'd learned to see value where other people saw junk. Because I'd been patient enough to wait for the right moment. Because I'd understood that real wealth isn't about dollar signs. It's about knowing what things are actually worth. The sun was almost down now. Last rays of light, painting the mountains gold. I looked at my grandfather's watch. Checked the time. 6:30. Right on schedule. This watch had been keeping time since 1943. Would probably keep going for another 100 years if someone took care of it. There's a saying, time heals all wounds. I don't think that's true. Time doesn't heal anything. Time just puts things in perspective, shows you what matters and what doesn't, separates the signal from the noise. You just have to be patient enough to let it work. Brad and Linda wanted justice on their timeline, wanted to win immediately, couldn't wait for the pieces to fall into place. I'd waited 23 years in a marriage that was dying, waited 20 years with a chronometer on a shelf, waited through meetings and negotiations and contracts, waited for the moment when their greed would make them blind. And when that moment came, I was ready, not because I'm smart, not because I'm special, because I'd learned patience from a craftsman who understood that precision takes time, that good work can't be rushed, that the best mechanisms don't make noise. They just keep perfect time. I finished my coffee, stood up from the chair. My knees creaked a little. 55 years of living, 30-some years of working with my hands. But I felt younger than I had in decades. Felt free. Felt like myself for the first time since I couldn't remember when. Walked into my workshop, turned on the lights. All my tools hanging on pegboards. All my projects lined up on the workbench. Pieces in various stages of restoration. No deadline. No pressure. No one calling it junk. Just me and the work, the way it was always supposed to be. There was a clock on the bench, 18th century lawn case, beautiful mechanism. Someone had tried to fix it themselves and made it worse. Brought it to me last month, said their grandmother had owned it, said it hadn't run since the 70s. I'd been working on it slowly, carefully, no rush. I sat down at the bench, picked up my tools, started working, the familiar rhythm of it. The precision, the focus, the way everything else falls away when you're working on something that requires your complete attention. This is what Linda never understood. This was never about money, never about status, never about winning. It was about the work, the craft, the satisfaction of taking something broken and making it whole. Outside, the stars were coming out. Montana sky. No light pollution out here. You could see everything. The Milky Way stretching across the darkness like a river of light. My grandfather used to tell me about navigation, about how sailors used to steer by the stars, how they'd learned to read the sky like a map, before chronometers, before GPS, before any of the technology we take for granted. They'd had patience, had learned to watch, to wait, to let the stars guide them home. That's all I'd done. Watched, waited, let the mechanism of the universe do its work. I worked on that clock for another hour. got the escapement adjusted properly, got the pendulum swinging true, wound it carefully, set it to the correct time, and listened as it started to tick. Steady, reliable, the sound of precision, the sound of something working exactly as it should. Tick, 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 not the jerky stutter of a cheap quartz movement pretending to be something it's not. The real thing, the sound of craftsmanship, of patience, of understanding how mechanisms actually work. I turned off the workshop lights, locked up, walked back to the house. My phone was on the kitchen counter. Had a message from Dr. Pemberton. He'd written another paper about H5. Wanted to know if I'd be willing to be interviewed about the discovery. I thought about it. Decided no. Didn't need the attention. Didn't need people knowing my story. The people who mattered already knew. And the people who didn't matter, well, they could keep thinking whatever they wanted. I made dinner. Nothing fancy. Steak and potatoes. The kind of meal my grandfather used to make. Ate it on the porch under the stars. Thought about Brad and Linda. Wondered what they were doing. If they ever thought about what they'd lost. Probably not. People like that don't tend to learn. They just move on to the next thing. The next deal. The next victory they think they've won. But sometimes, late at night, I bet Linda thinks about that garage. About the boxes she never bothered to look through. About the chronometer she declared worthless. I bet she thinks about signing that agreement. About declining the appraisal. About her own voice saying she wouldn't waste $5,000 on junk. I bet those thoughts keep her up sometimes. Me? I sleep fine. Sleep better than I have in 20 years. Because I know something she'll never understand. Real wealth isn't about what you own. It's about knowing the difference between price and value. It's about patience, about precision, about understanding how mechanisms work. It's about being able to look at something everyone else calls junk and see the masterpiece underneath. And most of all, it's about having the discipline to wait, to not rush, to let time do its work. The stars were bright overhead. The mountains were dark shapes against the sky. Somewhere in Chicago, in that glass tower, someone was probably working late, chasing billable hours, wearing a fake watch and thinking they were winning. Somewhere else, someone was scrolling through their phone, shopping for things they didn't need, trying to fill a void they didn't understand. And out here, in Montana, on my porch, I was exactly where I needed to be. My grandfather's watch ticked in my pocket. Steady, reliable, keeping perfect time, like it had for 80 years, like it would for 80 more, because good work lasts. Real craftsmanship endures. True value doesn't fade. You just have to be patient enough to recognize it, and wise enough to know that some victories take time. But they're worth the wait. Every single second of it. The hands on the watch move forward, marking time, never rushing, never stopping, just moving at the exact right pace, the way everything should,